taking advantage of the asymmetric benefits of cyber capabilities to focus their operations and use that power. We can identify their motivations, unique techniques and targets, and this gives us a better understanding of the global threat picture. For the blue teamers, hopefully you'll be able to gain some information that might help you improve your threat modeling and may give you something that you ask your red team to emulate in your next engagement. For the red teamers, hopefully you'll pick up some interesting tips. There's a lot of cool campaigns out there that we get to learn about. So let's go. A little bit about myself. My name's Yoshi. I do healthcare cyber threat intelligence. Have some certs. I got my background in political science, which is why I really enjoy the geopolitical aspect of threat intelligence. Used to be with the FBI about until 2018, and now I work in healthcare. So feel free to follow me on Twitter. So when we talk about threat intelligence, there are a lot of models to start talking about, hey, what is an adversary and what do they do? How do we classify them? How do we cluster them? My favorite and one of the older ones is the diamond model. So when we see the diamond model, we start first on the left angle, and that's infrastructure. So when we talk about infrastructure, we mean everything from the email accounts that are used to send phishing emails. We mean the command and control IPs, possibly the domain registrations, and all of that. So that's sort of what we mean when we talk infrastructure. So when we talk victim, I think victims more diverse than people think. First off, at a big level means country. What countries are targeted? How do they relate to the geopolitical things going on? Second, a little lower down would be what industry is targeted. Are they targeting healthcare? Are they targeting aerospace? Are they targeting any specific vertical that may be a requirement for a nation state? Little lower down would be, okay, what information at each of those companies are they going for? And then drilling down even more, what people are they talking to? Are they talking to and phishing the customer advocates at the company? Are they phishing the doctors, researchers? So that's sort of how we get fine-tuned into that victim part of the diamond model. As well as that, next we have capabilities. So capabilities, I like to use the attack matrix with capabilities because I think it gives a really good way of giving a objective view of capabilities and say, hey, this actor did these 3 different techniques, and those fall into their capabilities. Obviously, attack doesn't cover everything, especially for some of those more advanced techniques, but it does a really good job. And finally, looking at adversary. Depending on who you're talking to or who you're working for, adversary changes. So sometimes it means who is the human behind the keyboard? Who's the person that's actually typing those commands and exfiltrating that data? Sometimes it might be the organization that they work for. Is it a front company? Is it an intelligence organization? Or is it not the organization that's actually doing the hacking, but is there a customer of a government that's requested that data? Hey, we want airline data. Okay, well, who's asking those requirements? And that fits into the adversary piece of the diamond model. So next, we're talking about national responsibility. So this is a scale. Jason Healy put this out, and I think it's important to talk about when we talk about state nexus cyber actors. So it goes from the left, state prohibited. That's where the cyber actors don't work with the government, they don't work for the government. In fact, if the government knew what they were doing, the government would stop them. Most people would argue that for the most part, the United States is a state prohibited thing. If you start launching a DDoS attack, the government's gonna stop you, or at least they're gonna investigate you and come talk to you and then stop you. The next level up is state prohibited but inadequate. So what that means is that the state doesn't like that actors are doing certain activities, but they can't stop it. So they just don't have the resources, the time, whether it's corruption, whatever reason, that means they just can't do it. They're inadequate. Next is state ignored. State knows about it and just doesn't care. That's very close to the prior one, but just the motivation's not there to act against those individuals. And the next two are kind of similar. So the first one's state encouraged, and the next one's state shaped. So state encouraged basically means that the government is encouraging an actor to do something. And then state shape means they're actually giving them, hey, do the specific tasking. Usually these are third-party actors. A good example of this would be Iranian hacktivists. They don't work for the government. They're not necessarily members of the military, but they are advocating for what the government would want and conducting operations based off of that. So then we get up to state coordinated. So this is where the government's starting to talk to those contracting companies or those hackers and say, hey, this is who you should attack. Hey, please attack or target Boeing, please. And there's sort of that coordination there. The next one that's pretty close is going to be state ordered. So the government's actually telling you, hey, you need to attack a Boeing, and that's the state order. They're tasking you. You've been hired and you're being tasked. The eighth one's sort of interesting. That's the state rogue, but conducted. So what that means is we see it a lot with North Korean actors and Chinese actors, where they have their day jobs and that they're conducting state-sponsored intrusions, but then they're also moonlighting. So you have a uniformed actor who's then making some extra money on the side. That's the state rogue conducted. Finally is state executed. So that's when you have uniformed military or intelligence personnel that are actually conducting the operations on behalf of the state. And then last one above that is when those uniformed military folks or those intelligence officers bring in those third parties and they work in tandem. All right, so that's sort of a level of national responsibility that we'll go and talk about. So real quick, here's just a brief of some of the countries we'll be talking about. So let's get started. So we're going to start with the Netherlands. Now, when you think about technical operations and hackers, most people probably don't think about the Netherlands. No offense to anyone there, but that's not something that comes to mind at first. But in 2018, a Dutch newspaper revealed one of the most sophisticated and successful hacking operations against an APT, and I think it's pretty interesting. So the AIVD, Dutch intelligence, managed to get a clue into Cozy Bear's operations. Doesn't say exactly what that clue is, but regardless, they were able to then identify the building that Cozy Bear was sitting in. Of course, this is pre-COVID-19, so no one was working from home, but everyone was still in the building. And based off the good preparation and planning that they did, they were able to do more than just pop boxes on the network. They weren't just hacking Cozy Bear. They were able to hack into the security cameras and record everyone that was going to and from the building. So not only do they have access to the technical network, they can then identify individuals that are going to and from the building, which you can then coordinate for counterintelligence purposes. And this, according to the newspaper, allowed the Dutch to tip off the Americans about Cozy Bear's attacks against the State Department, including their infrastructure, C2 targets, and it also allowed them to attribute Cozy Bear to SVR. And that's, I think, it's pretty interesting as far as the Netherlands are concerned. So next, we have France. Really, France reportedly originated in 2007. They're known as Babar or Animal Farm. Their targeting included Iran, Syria, Mali, Malaysia, and others. What's interesting about France and Animal Farm, they had a very diverse set of malware that covered a lot of different platforms, but their targeting was extremely targeted. They worked really hard to only target the individuals that they wanted to. So one of the more advanced sets, but very targeted. Next, we have Spain, so known as the Mask or Correcto. According to Kaspersky, they also started in 2007, and they were reported on publicly and attributed in 2014. They were extremely advanced. They had over 300 victims in 31 countries, including governments, energy, research institutions, private equity, and activists. And the interesting thing is Kaspersky discovered them when they tried to exploit a vulnerability in a Kaspersky product. The other interesting thing, Kaspersky tracked them as one of their more advanced nation-state threats, in part because once Kaspersky started syncing their command and control servers, they shut down the operations and tore it down within, I think, a matter of hours. So really interesting that there was that level of visibility on their own infrastructure to conduct that OPSEC. As far as attribution goes, for this threat, they were able to attribute it through WHOIS information, obviously before GDPR, as well as Spanish language relations, both in the lures and the malware. So this is a beautiful picture. As part of the CyberSafari, you'll notice I'm putting in pictures of the places that I wish I could visit, and which I'm sure some of you do too. But this is actually from Turkey. So Turkey is really interesting to me, and again, not one of those countries that you wouldn't necessarily think of. The first actor that is attributed to Turkey is called Strong Pity or Prometheum. In 2016, Microsoft released a report talking about how Prometheum had been operating since 2012. The interesting thing is they've done campaigns against both domestic and international targets. Specific individuals within geopolitical interest. Another interesting fact is that they have done both phishing, like a lot of people do to get in, but then also strategic web compromises or watering holes. So they have that dual-pronged initial infection vector. Their 2016 campaign used a zero-day in Adobe and was actually delivered via instant messenger client, which again is another interesting way to deliver that phishing. Along with that, in one of their campaigns, one of their later campaigns, I think in 2018, they were started using Trojanized encryptors programs. Kaspersky mentioned that they targeted people both in Belgium and Italy, which is sort of interesting, but still with the locale setting set to Turkish. Kaspersky did an excellent job documenting Trovasis, the malware that was dropped after the initial infection. I'll have all the citations for all of this reporting available at the end for anyone that's interested. The other interesting thing is that this Strong Pity campaign in 2016 had strong ties with Neodium, another group Microsoft tracks. And that group actually probably uses Finfisher malware for espionage purposes, but they, between the two sets, saw shared targets and shared, I don't believe infrastructure, but shared targets in around the same time frame, which is an interesting correlation. Another interesting group for Turkey is Sea Turtle. So in April 2019, Cisco Talos reported on the group. They targeted national security organizations in the Middle East and North Africa, including organizations from Cyprus, Greece, Iraq, Albania, Egypt, Armenia, United Arab Emirates, Jordan, Syria, and Sweden. So quite a long list of countries. And Sea Turtle has the first publicly reported example of widespread DNS hijacking. The actors were extremely successful because what they first did was targeted third parties, whether that be the DNS registrars, the telecommunications companies, or the internet service providers. Once they gained access to those targets, they were then able to hijack the DNS of the primary targets, the national security organizations. So first, they used mostly known vulnerabilities and some phishing to get into those third parties. And then they changed the DNS settings to have a man-in-the-middle actor-controlled server. So what happened was they were able to redirect legitimate users from those organizations through their box and intercept and then harvest their credentials. It was extremely successful and widespread. According to Reuters, credentials included email service, email accounts, cloud services, and online network passwords and usernames. Their attribution that Reuters used, attributing them to actors acting in the Turkish interest, was based on three things. The first being victimology. We talked about all those countries being of geopolitical interest to Turkey. Similarities to past campaigns using these similar techniques, and then confidential intelligence that Reuters was shown. So obviously there is a ton that could be said about Israeli cybersecurity. I don't have the time, and I am nowhere near an expert to discuss everything that's going on in cybersecurity with Israel. So we're going to just look at two examples. First would be Dooku 2.0. And this, I think, is an interesting example because you see an example of fourth or possibly fifth party collection where hackers are hacking hackers to see the hackers. So the New York Times reported on the story where the Dooku 2.0 in Israel hacked into Kaspersky to gather intelligence. Kaspersky had eventually identified this campaign, but the Israelis were allegedly able to identify Russian hackers inside of Kaspersky, hacking Kaspersky, searching for American intelligence. So you have Israelis hacking Kaspersky, hacking with Russian hackers inside that were looking for information on American APTs. So quite a convoluted collection there. The attackers ended up stealing passwords, documents, screenshots, and emails related to APT work that Kaspersky was doing, particularly those related to the equation group and region. Other targets of the campaign that was identified include hotels and venues related to national security, specifically, the UN Security Council relating to the JPCOA or the Iran deal. Those were the hotels that were targeted. Again, Kaspersky put out a great blog. If you're interested in the group and Dooku 2.0, I definitely recommend looking into it. And also, when we talk about cybersecurity, we would be amiss to not mention the private companies in Israel. Probably one of the best known is the NSO group. And most of you probably know they're embroiled in a lawsuit against Facebook for using a WhatsApp vulnerability. So when we talk about Israel cybersecurity, what techniques can we look at to possibly improve our own craft? And what we've seen is that NSO tools like Phantom and Pegasus are almost supposed to be used for quote unquote legitimate purposes, but Vice has reported that they've been targeting human rights dissidents, journalists, and political opponents by the NSO group customers. So when we talk about actual campaigns, it looks like a lot of the lures appear to be unsubscribe links or Facebook links. That's something you wouldn't mind clicking on because, hey, it's just trying to unsubscribe. The other interesting thing is that the NSO group appears to have procured infrastructure from cloud providers in the United States. So it'll be interesting to watch this case continue and see what other infrastructure ends up getting burned through the lawsuit. So next we have Lebanon. And so EFF and Lookout originally identified Dark Coracle, a threat actor allegedly supporting the General Director of General Security in Lebanon. So it was first originally identified based off of infrastructure reuse from Operation Manuel, which we'll briefly discuss later. But Dark Coracle is considered an APT for a couple reasons. The first, they were able to conduct multiple campaigns at once, exfiltrating hundreds of gigabytes of data. So they were very successful in that way. EFF reported targets in the government, the military targets, utilities, financial institutions, healthcare, and manufacturing. Some of those hundreds of gigabytes of data that was exfilled include documents, call recordings, contacts, photos, and just general account information. The interesting piece about this campaign is that the mobile malware was used. That was actually the primary attack platform for this campaign. Initial access did start with phishing or social engineering, but then also this initial access also started with physical aspects to the targets. So someone actually had physical access to the phones of the targets that was being used. Palace, which is one of the names of the malware that was being used, one of the mobile malwares, was a Trojanized app that was submitted to the App Store. It's reported that Dark Coracle also used FinFisher malware, similar to what we talked about earlier with Neodium. The other malware used includes Bandukrat, Crossrat, and while the infrastructure being used for this was shared among multiple actors, the EFF was able to fingerprint some of it uniquely. And when we talk about attribution, this is one of the strongest attributed sets, because what happened was the logs and directories were open on the command control infrastructure. They were able to take those logs, identify the testing devices that were testing the infrastructure prior to the campaign being conducted. And then once they identified those testing devices, they also looked and saw the Wi-Fi networks associated with those devices. Based off of that, they then went and did some OSINT on those Wi-Fi devices or Wi-Fi networks rather, and were able to pinpoint those Wi-Fi networks to a specific building in Lebanon. And then on top of all of that, the command and control infrastructure had 3 IP addresses that were the main command and control, and those were controlled by actors, or the IPs were from the state-owned Ogero Telecom. So that's pretty strong attribution. So next we have the United Arab Emirates Stealth Falcon and Fruity Armor. So in 2016, The Intercept published an article detailing dark matter's recruitment of foreign cyber operators to hack for conduct offensive operations for the government. The report that was then followed up with reporting from Reuters that showed how ex-NSA hackers were hacking for Project Raven, which is what they called the Dark Matters project, from a mansion in Abu Dhabi. The interesting thing is that the alleged targets include human rights activists, journalists, and political rivals. The malware was called Karma and did not require any user interaction, and it obtained photos, text, and location information. It's possible, and it's been hypothesized that it used an iMessage 0 day. Also in 2016, Citizen Lab published a separate report on Stealth Falcon, and that report was targeted against, or the campaign reported on, targeted critics of the government of the UAE. What happened was the first stage was to profile the devices that the user was using, so the phishing link used a redirect URL to profile the devices, and then later on in the conversation, phish them with malware that was targeted to their device with a maldoc. And then that maldoc returned eventually got to a customized PowerShell backdoor similar to Empire, not the exact same, but similar. And then back in 2019, ESET republished a report about a binary that bears remarkable similarity to the backdoor that was disclosed by Citizen Lab in 2016. They noted the targets and similar, same thing of UAE, inside the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Thailand, and a mission to the Netherlands. One of the other ties to this attribution was the binary uses one of the same command and control domains as the PowerShell backdoor that was previously disclosed by Citizen Lab. So don't forget that the adversary also sometimes gets lazy and reuses infrastructure. So Morocco, yes, that is a camel from Morocco, according to Pixabay, was another company I was interested to find on some research on. So in 2018, Hyas found hacks against a variety of French infrastructure firms. Once they sinkholed the domain, they were able to obtain the registrant information and eventually found an email address for one of the DNS servers that was hosting the IP addresses. In March of 2020, Brian Krebs does what he does best of doxing people, took that email address, traced it through some forums, and found a Moroccan security researcher who was tied to the forum posts and that email. Of course, that security researcher denies being affiliated with any of the attacks because, of course, his email was hacked conveniently during the time. And at this point, we won't know who directed and sponsored the intrusion, but it's definitely an interesting example of the government sort of doing that state encouraged where they're directing, but not necessarily doing it themselves. So next, we have Uzbekistan. They've been around for a while. Their national police, SSS, first took interest in commercial hacking tools starting in 2011. And it came in light when Phineas Fisher dumped the hacking team stuff. In 2019, Brian Bartholomew from Kaspersky presented a virus bulletin on APT tied to Uzbekistan's intelligence agency. The strong attribution to the SSS was possible and due to horrible horrible OPSEC by the individual operators. Kaspersky was able to identify the team based off of the WHOIS records that listed the intelligence officer's true name and the military unit 02616. So literally just put it in the register information, did not understand how that was available to researchers. So that's the first OPSEC failure. The next OPSEC failure was that they had Kaspersky antivirus running on their testing machines. So once there was any sort of alert, Kaspersky was able to, one, see what they were testing, and two, grab it and profile it. So because of this, Kaspersky was able to grab and identify multiple 0 days that had been purchased by the organization in Uzbekistan. And this just shows that this sort of visibility that the antivirus softwares have, especially in countries outside the US, is really interesting and it's excellent for hunting those smaller adversaries. So another beautiful view. Not sure, I had never seen this sort of view before, but this is actually in Pakistan. So when we talk about Pakistan, we have a couple different groups that are attributed. So the first one is going to be Gordon Group. It's interesting because of the wide range of both espionage and financially motivated campaigns, sort of getting to where we see that that rogue actor, that rogue state actor going on. So in February of 2018, Unit 42 identified the Gordon Group targeting the UK, Spain, Russia, and the United States. Those same campaigns actually shared infrastructure with financially motivated campaigns. Couple of the interesting things about this group is they used URL shortening. So it allowed them both to track their own metrics, which is always good when you are conducting campaigns, but also allowed researchers to enumerate and collect metrics on the actor themselves. When we talk about capabilities for this group, they used a variety of rats. Most of the time they use NJRAT, then also use info stealers like LokiBot. And back in October of 2019, Prevaileon, the security vendor, talked about another campaign that they were doing. The alert documents again used URL shortening services, and this time they redirected to Blogspot URLs. So you have the phishing that redirected to Blogspot. The JavaScript reached out to Pastebin and ran some code to establish persistence via scheduled tasks and registry keys. And then once those changes were successful, another Pastebin URL was accessed. And after all of those Pastebin infection chains, the infection chain eventually led to a rat. It was Revenge Rat, and then it became Azeralt while they were monitoring it. So really interesting case there. The other APT tied to Pakistan is Transparent Tribe, or Mythic Leopard, or sometimes APT36, depending on who you're talking to. In 2016, Proofpoint's Darren Huss published some research that identified phishing attacks targeting Indian military resources. The phish included a weaponized RTF document that dropped a PE that eventually led to a rat. Interesting thing is, in addition to these phishing campaigns, they also had registered multiple blogs to act as sort of watering holes. They had posted examples that the Indian military, or articles that the Indian military would be interested in, whether it be about discipline issues, about the latest unrest, I believe, with China, and they were able to allegedly get some victims from that as well. And that dual-pronged approach is something that I think is pretty interesting. In 2017, SysInfo reported actors tied to Transparent Tribe targeted officials from the Indian Central Bureau of Investigation and the Indian Army while masquerading as the Institute for Defense Analyses. As we've seen, this continues the historic targeting of, past targeting of Indian government officials. In May of 2018, CrowdStrike continued this trend by reporting that they were using generic Excel-themed lures and then a customized Visual Basic script to install a variety of implants. Again, CrowdStrike identified Mythic Leopard C2s that were used against or for multiple campaigns. The long-running C2 infrastructure is an OPSEC failure, but it's also sometimes a necessity. It's already set up, it's already configured, and depending on the adversary's goals, may be good enough. And then just recently, back in March, Malwarebytes reported that this actor, like many others, had begun using COVID-19 related lures and had shifted their targeting from both India to then also Afghanistan as well. So this next picture of a tiger from India. So you'll notice that this slide is not nearly as neat as the others. That's because Indian cybersecurity attribution is a mess, both on the state nexus operations and on the criminal operations. We're going to look at some of the campaigns that have a nexus to India and talk about different threat groups, but overall, it's just a general mess. So in March of 2018, a Chinese security vendor started talking about a specialized lures that were targeting Chinese government agencies. The lure document ended up dropping a .NET executable, QRAT, that scheduled tasks, and then eventually led to another RAT. Documents were then exfilled via HTTP post to the C2. A couple other vendors reported similar things in this time, but including a campaign against the US as well. So this APT used similar techniques in the campaign against both Chinese government officials and US think tanks, while masquerading as a US think tank. What they also did, and I'm sure some of the red teamers out here have also done this, is used an embedded image in an email to track the beacon back to track who actually opened the emails and who had been clicking. It was unique, so it allowed it actually who was clicking. And again, the final payload of that campaign was KSRRAT. The interesting thing is that the actual exploit that was used was pulled from proof of concept that had been published on GitHub and was likely not developed internally to Patchwork. And that copy and pasting from GitHub and open source is actually what gave this APT the name of Patchwork. A deception vendor, Symmetria, saw a threat actor operating in one of their deception platforms, and they were able to then go out and grab the lures from that document. What they saw was two things. One, they saw a variety of tools that had been downloaded and taken from GitHub, but they were able to also obtain the lure documents that the APT was using. In this campaign, it was all related to China and the South China Sea. And used, like we talked about, the vulnerabilities and exploits that were available publicly. And these allegedly state-sponsored based adversaries for India have not gone anywhere. In fact, Unit 42 just recently released reporting on Viceroy Tiger in early May. This activity targeted government and military organizations. And what's interesting is they really cared about being detected. So they really tried hard to blend in and assume that they were impersonating legitimate services. So they did this in a couple ways. They used things like self-signed certificates so that the software was signed, unique file descriptions so it just looked like another piece of corporate software that you'd find on your machine, and then also convincing error messages. There weren't typos. It was a pretty convincing campaign. The interesting thing is that instead of just attaching the maldocs to their phishing campaign, they were able to directly deliver documents. So instead of doing that, the actors hosted their payloads on compromised third-party websites within the country of their targeting. So they were targeting, when they targeted Pakistan, they compromised websites that were already in Pakistan and then hosted documents there. This gave them some plausibility and added another layer of obfuscation, and also got around some of the geofencing that you might see in a typical environment. And I think in some ways, even more interesting than the Indian state-sponsored activity would be the Indian hacking for hire. The two main names that come to mind that have been publicly reported are Appen Security, and then the second one just broke this week while I was finalizing slides, but was Dark Basin by Citizen Lab. Both operations have targeted a variety of individuals, including attorneys, dissidents, and journalists. The EFF reported that Operation Manuel was in use by a variety of organizations, including those from Kazakhstan, and then the campaign that led to the ties to Dark Caracal from Lebanon. Dark Basin, on the other hand, seemed to have two different types of campaigns that was reported by Reuters and Citizen Lab. The first seemed to be more aggressive, trying to force the user to unsubscribe so that they just stop getting the emails. It's loud, it's noisy, but it seemed to work, of just consistently pounding spam emails, sometimes pornographic content, in order to try to just get the user to say, I'm done. Click unsubscribe, like get me off of this list. The other was more targeted and masqueraded as legitimate service, maybe Google Photos, and was targeted to the individual users and said, hey, please share this photo album with me, whatever that looks like. Definitely more targeted than we had seen in the past. So if you're interested in following APTs, there's a bunch of researchers that post hashes and malware samples on Twitter. If you search for hashtag Sidewinder, you'll start getting a variety of malware samples to look at. Really interesting stuff. So next we have these beautiful mountains. These mountains are actually from South Korea. I think South Korea is one of the most interesting threat countries from my point of view. We'll talk about two. The first is Hyasa. It's been active since 2016. Targeting includes China, North Korea, Japan, Nepal, Singapore, Russia, Poland, and Switzerland. It's interesting because their capabilities include a keylogger, Outlook, credential harvester, and then Ghostrat. What's interesting about Hyasa is that their phishing comes around the holidays and offers blessings or thanks to people. So it was one of those e-cards that we used to get saying, hey, happy holidays from the Smith family. Similar technique, especially focused though on North Korean holidays as well, which is interesting. The other new thing about this group is that they are able to fish very quickly related to the news. So in some days, and sometimes less than 4 days after news broke, it was already being used in lures for phishing. Another campaign that they were doing that Prevailing mentioned was corresponded to the release of a new software. So the company that was being spoofed, the actor had already prepared a campaign and then sent out that campaign the same day that they released their new software. So we don't know if it's coincidence or they just got lucky or they were planning it ahead of time, but either way, it's very convincing when you can get brand new news and fresh articles into the hands of users, into their inboxes. For attribution for this set, interesting because it comes from both timestamps, meaning the working hours, and yes, that can always be changed based off of how many people work nights. But for the most part, it's a good baseline. The other interesting thing is there was an artifact left in some of the malware that referenced naver.com, which is Korea's biggest search engine. And that was in one of the documents in the document field. So that helps with attribution for this set. Dark Hotel, also known as Shadow Crane, is one of my favorite APTs. They've been active since 2007. In 2014, Kim Zetter reported on the hotel attacks against some VIPs, specifically on high-profile guests. So what happened there was the actors were already on the Wi-Fi, and once the individual that they were targeting logged on, they were targeted saying, hey, your Adobe needs to be updated. And then they download, of course, the fake update that then gave them access to the target's computer. So interesting, they had a kernel level keylogger. They used 0 days in their spear phishing. Overall, their campaigns, they used .hta downloaders consistently. So that's one of the TTPs that they were known for. Another TTP that they are known for was consistent phishing. So you may not accept that attachment when it first comes in February, but if you keep getting that same attachment from the same person in March, April, and May, by May, it's, hey, this is just a normal thing, and your defenses are down, and then you're more likely to open that attachment. As part of that specific campaign, they also configured their C2 pages to look like normal web pages if you visit the wrong page. So if you just browse to it in a web browser, Kaspersky reported You'd often see pictures of artisanal ice cream or other comics completely unrelated to their target, sort of trying to increase that OPSEC, especially when researchers come and poke around the site. And the group has used plenty of 0 days. In this last spring, Kaspersky released a report talking about Dark Hotel using an Internet Explorer vulnerability. The interesting thing about this report was that some targets appeared to be geolocated to South Korea. At this time, it's unclear whether or not they belong to multinational companies or actual South Korean citizens. It would be consistent if South Korean geopolitical aims solicited information from those companies. There'd be competitors. So, hey, you're a multinational company, your South Korean branch gets phished to help advance the South Korean state nexuses. Really excited about this next picture because it's beautiful. Yes, that is a buffalo, and that's right, we're going to Vietnam. So Vietnam, interesting target, APT-32, Ocean Lotus. It's really interesting because with the right visibility, it's easy to see how their campaigns align with their state interests. Nick Carr, formerly of FireEye, now with Microsoft, did a great job of reporting what FireEye saw. So first, they saw Ocean Lotus had been active since 2014. They first publicly talked about it in 2017. Ocean Lotus targeted foreign corporations with manufacturing, consumer products, and hospitality sectors. They also, in different campaigns, targeted the Vietnamese diaspora, journalists, and activists, along with the government agencies. And then, so what's interesting with this is that it's not just straight intellectual property theft. So what they're serving sort of a law enforcement or audit purpose. So Nick Carr gives this example of auto manufacturing. So Vietnam implemented strict regulations on how to import cars. And following those laws being enacted, multiple car manufacturers, including Toyota and BMW, were then attacked in late 2019 by Ocean Lotus. Oftentimes, these attacks came right after those car manufacturers had just been meeting with the government. So really unique targeting there. Additionally, we see that when we talk about investment data, they might not be targeting the direct company that's investing in Vietnam, but they'll target the accountants that are helping that company. So it's sort of that third-party targeting. We also see Ocean Lotus or APT-32 conducting targets against government-sponsored or government organizations, mostly located regionally. According to the EFF, they've also been known to target journalists, activists. We talked about the diaspora. One interesting thing is that Ocean Lotus, either on accident or on purpose, leaked transcripts between the Philippine president with world leaders, including both the Chinese and the US presidents. And they uploaded those to VirusTotal. Whether or not that was intentional or not, we don't know, but something interesting to look at. So when we talk about Vietnam, it's also important to talk about Phantom Lance. Phantom Lance was just reported a few months ago and does share some overlap with Ocean Lotus. Kaspersky estimated that they've been active since 2016. They serve as mobile malware. And the one interesting things that they do, when they first upload malware to the Play Store, it's clean. So it's just a regular app. But then subsequent updates is when they end up containing malicious payloads in code. Some of their targets include India, Bangladesh, Vietnam, Indonesia, Nepal, Myanmar, and Malaysia. Again, just an interesting mobile malware campaign. There are some overlaps as far as infrastructure goes with APT-32 and Ocean Lotus, but not enough to conclusively tie them together. So our last threat actor for today is located in Latin America and goes by Machete. It's possibly Colombia or Venezuela. It's been active since 2010 and revamped its infrastructure in 2012. It is a Spanish-speaking APT, which is interesting. And they look for photos from webcams, geolocations, audio from microphones, sort of all those things that you'd want in an espionage set. Victims from Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and Russia. So this is hard because when we talk about usually using victims to help cluster and help do attribution. If you have a lot of victims in the same country as that's originating the set, it makes that a lot harder to do. Again, it's an interesting set because primarily it's Spanish speaking. So just the Correcto and then Machete are two of the Spanish speaking APTs that we've seen. So what? So let's talk about trends that we've seen the adversaries been doing. We've talked about a lot of adversaries. There's more out there, and I'm not an expert on all of them by any means, but I think we've seen that it's evident that smaller governments are using cyber capabilities, and they're using these APT-style attacks on dissidents, journalists, and sometimes their own citizens. If you have employees or friends in these groups, please make sure they're protected. Google Advanced Protection Program is now free and open to everyone. Get a hardware token, get them to work. Definitely worth looking at. And I think as defenders, if we're working in a multinational company, when was the last time that you threat modeled the multitude of governments that may affect your operations? Do you have operations in South America that may have local offices targeted by Machete? Do you do business in Vietnam or South Korea? So is that something that you should worry about? Sometimes you may not. You may be a US-based company that doesn't have any interests or high-profile VIPs traveling, and this talk may not be directly useful for you, and that's okay. But it's important to identify what threats affect your company, especially if you're multinational. One of the best ways to do that is to look at regional security companies. So outside, the Fire and CrowdStrike are great, but their visibility is limited. Looking and talking to some of those smaller companies, whether they be based in Europe or China or Asia, is important to get that full visibility. And I guess the other thing is, if you've seen unique regional targeting, please share it, blog about it, tweet about it, do a talk about it. We want to see that regional visibility that we might not see from America. And it's really interesting because a lot of these threat actors are doing some cool stuff. So last thing, all the images were from Pixabay. All of the research that I've talked about is located on Pastebin. I'll also post that link in the Discord, as well as answer any questions. Feel free to scan the QR code if you also want to go to that Pastebin site to look at all of that research. There's a lot of really good work being done, and the researchers did a great job documenting it from a variety of vendors. So please go look at those sources if anything I said makes sense. That's all I have. Thank you. And I'll be around. I'll stick in the Discord to answer any questions that anyone has. But thanks so much, everyone.